Hey guys, welcome back to part two of my 7 round 32 team mock draft walkthrough. We ended part one in round five with Jabbar Muhammad as the last pick for the Dolphins, with me as the GM. As a refresher, the other picks that we had were round one, pick 13, Jade Barron, round two, pick 48. Tyleek Williams. We traded up to pick 72, trading picks 98, 135, and 150. And in that pick 72 spot, we picked Ariante Ursery. Round four, pick 116, picked Savion Jones. And then, like I said, round five, pick 155, went with Jabbar Muhammad. So I like the way the roster has filled out so far with this draft. Heading into our 3 7th round picks, I would still like to add a running back to the roster. Right now we only have Achan, Wright, and Madison, so definitely room for at least one more in there. Um, Once we're done with the draft, we're going to talk some about both trades that were made and some of the ones that weren't made to see how we could have handled this better using 2020 hindsight. And then once we're done with that, then we're going to go back and revisit the roster and look at how it could look if the Dolphins were to do something similar to what we're doing in this mock draft. So you can see on the screen right now is the rest of round five of the draft. It was a tough spot because we're going from round five, pick 17, and we're not going to be drafting again unless we trade up until round seven to 24. So certainly opportunity for a lot of names to go off the board here. And as we're looking through here, obviously got a couple of guard prospects that Dolphins fans seem to like in Jalen Rivers and Dylan Fairchild. Um, Will Howard is a quarterback that gets some attention. Chase Lunt is a kind of raw offensive tackle, and then a couple more trench players to round out round five. All right, round six. We don't have a pick here, but we're still going to put it up here just so you can see who was drafted and quickly kind of go through here. Got Kyle McCord is a QB that some fans are interested in. Ollie Gordon has been a name that I've heard. Jackson Halls is a blocking tight end I've seen some interest in. Um, as we continue to go down through here, Clay Webb got some attention coming out of the Senior Bowl. Kobe King is a linebacker that I liked. Jake Majors being a center out of Texas in the wide zone scheme they run there. Small school guy, and Carson Vincent out of Alabama A&M. And then as we continue through, Phil Maffa was a guy that I kind of liked as a, maybe a later than 6th round pick. More of a bigger back for the folks that want that power type runner. And then Trevor Etienne was one that I was hoping would get into the 7th round. With missing out on Bashaw Tootin earlier in the draft, Etienne was kind of my backup plan there. As you can see, that obviously didn't work out. And then we've got Willie Lampkin, another kind of fan favorite among Dolphin fans. And then get down here to the end. Dylan Gabriel was a quarterback that I probably would have considered in the 7th round there. I like the stuff that he does. It's not just that he's a lefty. I think that his skills translate pretty well if we're trying to continue to run a similar offense to what we have when two is in there, but he was gone end of the 6th round. And then Chimere DK is another player that we talked about on Scouting the Fins. Would have been another guy that I was looking at in round seven, but didn't make it there. As we move into the 7th round here, going to show you up until our first pick of the 7th round. Biggest name coming off the list here is Q Robinson. This is a player that I've talked about early in the draft. I think this is great value for him. Um, you know, a player that the reason I didn't pick him earlier was just between the edge and the off-ball linebacker room. Didn't know how many snaps he would be able to get, but I think he's a a hybrid type player there. I think he's going to be a good player in the league, and certainly wouldn't be disappointed to see him as a Dolphin. Right here at pick 224, I decided to go with Khalil Mullings out of Michigan. So, like I said, running back was something that I wanted to find somebody else to add to the room here before the end of the draft. Um, with Tootin and ETN going off the board, I really only had one more running back left on the list of backs that I had scouted, and I wasn't really high on him. So I started asking around a little bit, and Mullings was a name that came up, and I went and started checking out some of his highlights. Need to dig deeper into him, but definitely liked what he brought to the table. You know, he's not the back that I talked about from the beginning of this whole process of where, he can step in and do the things that Devon Achan does. But when I watched Mullings, he kind of reminds me of Raheem Mostert. Maybe doesn't have quite the breakaway speed that Mostert does, but in terms of a player that sees the hole well, is able to, ride that wave is something we talked about with Mostert, and, pretty much more of a straight line runner than somebody that's going to make somebody miss. I felt like that was a lot of what described Mullings when I was watching him as well. So when we move forward and we're looking to replace what Raheem Mostert had in this room, I think that Mullings is going to be a good fit in that aspect. Like I said, doesn't get exactly what I was looking for in the running back room, but when we're all the way down here in round 7, a lot of it comes down to just picking good players and, if they pan out, figuring out how to best use them. And then just taking a look here at the rest of round 7 up to pick 231, where we're picking again. Howard Cross is a player that I kind of liked, but at this point, with already having Savion Jones and Tyleek Williams, probably not somebody that I was going to pick in the 7th round anyways. Nobody else really in that range that, I felt bad about missing out on at 231. All right, so that brings us to pick 231. And our pick here is Caleb Rogers out of Texas Tech. Um, wasn't necessarily the highest player on my board, but I've talked in the past about, finding the guys that fit the scheme, right? And from a tape perspective, Caleb Rogers was a pretty difficult player to evaluate. A lot of passing in that Texas Tech offense. Didn't have a whole lot of good film. Not necessarily good film, just not a lot of film in terms of a run blocker to project him into what we hope to be more of a run heavy offense. So difficult projection. But when you look at his measurables and talking about the mold of linemen that have been drafted by Kyle Shanahan and Mike McDaniel since Shanahan took over in San Francisco in 2017, Caleb Rogers is one of those guys, and maybe the last one on the list of guys that fit perfectly into the mold based on the highs or lows of the measurables that they, the tests, the physical measurements, all of that stuff. So from a traits standpoint, Caleb Rogers fits perfectly into what they've looked for in the past for linemen in this scheme, has good tape to go with it, and that combination for me just felt like a perfect match for round 7, and that's why I picked Caleb Rogers here to add to the offensive line room. All right, quick look here at the rest of round 7 before our last pick at 253. So you had Caleb Rogers here at 231. And then as we go through, we're at the end of the draft, so not a lot of names that are going to be that exciting. Kamon Rucker is one that I'm higher on than 7th round. Probably would not have been my pick, but a player that I like, and that would probably be the main one in this group after Caleb Rogers of players that at least interest me late in the draft. And that's going to bring us to the last pick for the Dolphins in this draft. And my selection was safety out of Vanderbilt, DeRicky Wright. And this was very much a traits type pick. This is a guy that's 6'4", 229 pounds, a lot of experience playing safety in the SEC. But a big part of this with that size, and I think he's going to run decent. I haven't seen his numbers yet. Um, but a special teams guy, right? This is a guy that, as a low seventh round pick, can come in and be a core special teams contributor. And then as far as developing in the defense, maybe he's a hybrid type player, a linebacker safety hybrid. Maybe you groom him behind a Melifonwu to play a similar role to what he does. Um, but very much a traits pick, and as opposed to going with a offensive lineman or a quarterback in terms of traits, decide to go with somebody that I feel can be an immediate contributor in terms of special teams and find his way on the roster and find his way onto the field on Sundays. And then, really, just for the sake of being comprehensive, here are the last picks in the seventh round for this draft. Right. So, as we wrap up the draft, I wanted to go back and kind of look at all the players that we have drafted in one list. So, we picked Jade Barron round one, pick 13. I think that the opinions on that pick will largely come down to whether you view Barron as just a slot cornerback or whether you view him as more. In the games that I watched, it looked to me as though Texas was using him as a boundary corner on early downs. And then when they went into those nickel situations, that's when he would bump in to play a corner or a safety type role. So I think he's a really versatile piece. I think he can step in and be a starting corner from day one. But I think that if that's all that you're looking at him as, then I think that you're really limiting his effectiveness. So I still like that pick at 13. Pick 48, Tyleik Williams. Like I said before, I have him graded very similarly to Kenneth Grant as well as Alfred Collins. It seems like a guy that most don't talk about as much, more because they're not familiar with him than that they don't like his tape. But I encourage you to, go to Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. In that search bar, type in Tyleik Williams, click on the media tab, and just scroll through some of those plays. And you'll see some really high level stuff from him. Ursary here at pick 72 in round three was a pick that we traded up for, not necessarily for Ursary, but decided to go best player available. And a player that I like, and I think that he could find a way on the field early, whether that's as a guard, right, or whether he's that number one option as a swing tackle. So I still like that pick in terms of, wanting to add another piece to the offensive line room that I'm confident can come in and play from day one. Savion Jones, similar to Barron, like if you look at how he's listed as an edge player, and that's the way that you view Savion Jones, then you're probably not going to like that pick. But for me, being I think he's 6'5", 280 in that range, I view him more like a Emmanuel Ogba type edge in the sense that he could be a 4-3 defensive end. But in the Dolphin scheme, I see him more as a early down defensive end that can, be a good run stopper. And then when you get to those third down situations, can kick inside and can abuse a guard with his quickness. I don't think that he's a starting player from day one, especially if we get Tyleik Williams in the room. But a player that I feel can rotationally come in and give you some good snaps. We get to round five, and we went with Jabbar Muhammad, another situation where some of the players that we wanted went off the board. And, rather than reaching on a position of need, I decided to pick another cornerback. Not a player that I'm confident will come in and be a starter or play significant snaps, but a player that has the physical tools that I can certainly see a scenario where he comes in and he, beats out a Storm Duck, maybe a Cam Smith, and is your dime type defender. Um, but as a defensive back, you also have the value of being able to play special teams. Going into round seven, saw some of the running backs that would have been, my preferred type of running backs go off the board. Ended up going with Khalil Mullings, who, is probably more similar to what we have in the room in a Jalen Wright and similar to an Alexander Madison. But, seventh round pick, we're really just looking for somebody to come in and try to develop. And there were certainly things in Mullings as a running back that I liked. So, like the upside pick there and a body that was needed to fill out a room that had an opening. Caleb Rogers fits every way you can think of physically, but the scheme is completely different that he used in college from what Miami does. So a bit of a projection here. But again, seventh round pick. This is the type of player that you should be looking for that, maybe doesn't have the tape that backs it up in the system that you're running, but has the traits that fit there and could possibly project into, a future starting lineman. And then finish it up with Dericky Wright at safety. And like I, just talked about a couple minutes ago, this really comes down to a 6'4", 229-pound safety that, maybe can develop into something in your defensive packages, but from day one with his size and athleticism can participate in just about every special teams you have. So I think it's a good opportunity for a late seventh round pick to find a way onto that 53-man roster and find a way to contribute on game days. All right, as we wrap up this mock draft, wanted to kind of circle back and talk about this whole draft idea of 32 teams, 7 round mock drafts. And huge shout out to Jolene. It takes a lot to get 32 GMs together and have it run smoothly, and she did a great job with it. One of the things that's really unique about doing it this way is that you've got 32 different people representing the 32 teams, and all of those people are going to have different big boards. So players are going to be ranked very differently. It's not just going onto a website, clicking start, and having it fly through every other pick using, the same big board where you can look at their rankings and have an idea what's going to happen. When you don't see everybody else's big board, you really have no idea where the rest of these players are going to go, right? So then you're stuck in a position. Are you sitting there waiting for a player to fall and you lose out on them? Do you end up, maybe trading up to get a player and reaching just to make sure that you get them? So, want to kind of take a look at, using the whole hindsight is 2020 idea, looking back over the draft and what would I have done if I could go back and, see the board before all this happened. And the big thing here is that that trade up from 98 to 72. I don't the trade value was there for me, right? But the problem was that the player was not. The player that I really wanted to come up for was Jonah Savanaya. And I tried to wait as long as I could to make the pick given the format that we were using, right? So I waited until around pick 60 before I pulled the trigger on that trade. And, in a real life situation, I'd have probably waited until pick 70 before, given the green light to submit the trade. But, you know, having a more virtual environment, couldn't wait that long, ended up making the trade, saw my player go off the board, and ended up getting Ursary, who I like. But if that had happened in real life, I probably would have never made the trade. So what would I have done had I had our original picks, right? So had we gotten to 98, I think probably the top player that I still had on my board was going to be CJ West, right? I think that he's a player that could have come in, could have complemented Tyleik Williams well in terms of playing a different style of position on that defensive line. More of a guy that I could see rotating with Benito Jones at more of a 0-1 technique player. But the question then comes in after drafting a defensive back in round one, defensive line in round two. Would I have gone defensive line again in round three? Um, Looking back, I'd like to say that I would, but don't know without being in that position. Other option might have been Danny Stutzman, who went at 107. But that's a player that I really liked, but not necessarily a position I liked as much. So it probably would have been between those two players. So had we gone CJ West or Stutzman there with our third pick instead of going offensive lineman, then I almost certainly would have gone with Miles Frazier at pick 116. He ended up going at our original round five pick of 150, but I would not have continued to wait for that. Would have saw an opportunity for a player that I could have competed for that starting left guard spot, and I would have picked Miles Frazier at 116 over Savion Jones, especially if we'd gotten CJ West at 98. With West and Miles Frazier, then there was an opportunity to trade up to 135. And had I not made the original trade up to 72 and still had all of our original picks, I probably would have made that move to trade from 150 up to 135. And my pick there would have been Bashal Tutin, who ended up going at 140. I considered getting him earlier. That 116 pick, he was in the talks there for me as well. And I feel like he would have added a lot to that running back room, having a lot of similarities to Devon Achane. So I feel like I'd have made that move to move up to 135 and get Bashal Tutin. And then when we get to whether it was 150 or 155, whatever was left, probably would have gone interior offensive lineman there, whether it was somebody like Jackson Slater or Jalen Rivers. So that's just kind of the gist of what I feel I would have done, looking back on it using 2020 hindsight and seeing how the board fell. That's probably how I would have gone had I not made that trade up to 72. Another thing to talk about here is in real life, what do the trade scenarios look like? So in this mock draft, there was only one trade in the top 20, and that was for New Orleans to move up 5 spots and get Shador Sanders. So there's not a lot of interest in moving up to 13. So when you're one of those, fans that are looking at it and saying, let's just trade down from 13, you got to have a dance partner, and really didn't seem to have that opportunity in this draft. Most of the trades happen between picks 21 and 33, which is not somewhere that the Dolphins, have anything right now. And those teams weren't moving down past number 40. So trading from 48 up may not really be a, realistic scenario either. So I would say that when you're looking at these draft picks, that picks 13 and pick 48 are probably two that you're going to stick where you are and pick. And then after that is maybe where you could look to either move up or move down and add some more draft picks. All right, last thing we wanted to look at for part two of this mock draft video was going to be to circle back to the roster and see how the players we picked fit in and fill out this roster. Wide receivers we talked about early, right? Waddle, Westbrook, Akine, Hill, Washington, probably basically locked in as your top four. So we didn't go wide receiver. Not disappointed in that. Didn't feel a pressing need to add anything there. Offensive line. So I think this comes down to, I think you can, depending on how you feel about Patrick Paul, can say that you're pretty comfortable with 4 out of the 5 starters on the offensive line, right? Liam Eichenberg is obviously the one that nobody is comfortable with being penciled in here at left guard. But my thing here is that, if you have 4 solid players in the offensive line and you're only looking to fix one position, and that position is a guard, then you can usually find a way to do that. There are guys on the roster that are quality players, right? You got Keon Smith, you have Andrew Meyer, who the team likes that, maybe cross trains at guard. You have Larry Borum that was signed as a free agent. We added 2 players that I like on the offensive line in Ariante Ursary, Caleb Rogers, right? So if all you're looking to fill is a left guard, right, you can find something there that can come in and should be able to play decent. Look at the Philadelphia Eagles, the way that they brought Mekhi Becton in to play right guard. Not a player that you would project playing right guard, and not a player that I'm huge on as a guard, right? But when you have 4 guys around him that can all play at a high level, then it can still look like a good resolution. And I see that the same way as what the Dolphins could do at left guard if this is the way that draft day would turn out. Tight end, could have gone Tyler Warren in the first round, right? Could have tried to get Mason Taylor, but didn't really like the opportunities that we had there. The room with Pharaoh Brown replacing Durham Smythe is better than it was last year. Didn't have the guys in the positions that I wanted to be a developmental F piece. So we didn't touch this room, and I'm okay with that overall. Quarterbacks, didn't feel pressed to get a young developmental guy because I think Zach Wilson, in addition to filling QB2, also fills that role. If they did get somebody, wouldn't be disappointed, but not something that I really felt pressed to do in this draft. Running back room, had a hole in the running back room, would have liked to fill it with a different type of player, right? Whether it was a Bashaw Tootin, a Trevor Etienne, but those guys didn't go where I, felt like I could get them. So instead of, forcing a square peg into a round hole and drafting another smaller, faster back that I wasn't as high on, decided to go with Khalil Mullings, who I think is just another good player to, fill out a spot that needed somebody in that room. As we move over to the defensive side of things, defensive line was the biggest hole on the roster, and I really like the two pieces that we got to add to that room. I think there's still room to add to it, whether it is a UDFA or whether it is a free agent signing, right? Tyleik Williams replaces Dickerson as your starting left defensive end from day one. I think he provides a lot of versatility in terms of ways that he can line up and do different things on the defensive line. And kind of, same idea with Savion Jones. I don't see him as an edge player. I see him as a, defensive lineman more so, lining up in those wider, those five techniques on early downs, and then being able to bump into your two or your three techniques on passing downs. So like the way that room looks, could add somebody there. Um, and then so the edges and the linebackers, two positions that there were players that I liked, right? But as we got to those positions and we looked at the players available that I like in the linebacker and the edge room, it came down to how many snaps would really be available for those players considering what we added. And, it kept coming back to players that were either rated higher or rated similar in positions that were of bigger need of guys that could get snaps. So didn't do anything to either of those rooms and not necessarily disappointed in that either. As we talk about the cornerbacks, right? Don't want to go into the season with Storm Duck and Cam Smith as our top options to start along with Jalen Ramsey and Cater Kohu. So I felt it was important to get a day one starter and feel like we did do that with Jade Barron. I think he steps in day one and slots in nicely with Ramsey and Kohu in terms of another guy who's not, in my opinion, not strictly a slot guy, not strictly a boundary guy. Really, that addition would give them the versatility to be more matchup specific, right? If you decide that Jalen Ramsey is still your number one corner and you want to have him mirror another team's number one receiver, you can do that with guys like Barron and Kohu, who both have that versatility along with Ramsey to play in the slot and on the boundary. So I think that provides just a ton of flexibility and a player that can replace Ramsey as your number one corner as Ramsey continues to get older in this league. At safety, a room that I wouldn't say that I like a lot or love, but a room that I'm okay with the way that it exists today, right? So wasn't pressed to add something there. And if I did add something, wasn't the type of players that tended to be available when I was picking for the Dolphins, right? It was, more the Billy Bowman, the center fielder type player, where I feel that Ashton Davis and Patrick McMorris are both in those roles as well. So I really, if I would have gone safety, it would have been more of a guy that could play closer to the line of scrimmage. In the end, added to Ricky Wright, right, as a player that is going to be more of a hybrid linebacker safety, close to the box type role. No idea if he would contribute early in his career on the defense, but this pick was more about, you know, adding the right type of body to the room and adding somebody that can contribute on every special teams you have from day one. So overall, I like the way that this draft went for me. I feel like I really filled out the roster in a way that makes sense think we added good pieces in the places that really needed it, and also added some development pieces at the end of some rooms that could be contributors down the line. So maybe not the exact draft that I would have done with the hindsight 2020, but I am still very pleased with the way it turned out. As always, feel free to leave a comment below. Let me know whether you like this draft. Let me know whether there's something you would have done differently, since you can see every pick that was made over these last two videos. And if you've stuck around for all of this two-part series, really appreciate that.